Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today to commemorate the 2024 CDSS Death Awareness Month event. Our theme this year is Advancing Language Equity for Deaf State Employees. My name is Ann Hill. My pronouns are she and her, and I serve as a racial equity technical assistance and training specialist. It is an honor to welcome all of you to this important event where we come together to uplift, support, and advance language access and equity for deaf employees in the state workforce. We are breaking down systemic barriers. Today's event is a celebration of inclusion and a recognition of an ongoing work toward ensuring that every employee, regardless of hearing ability, has equitable access to communication, resources, and opportunities. To ensure all CDSS staff have access to today's presentation, the presentation is being held on both Microsoft Teams Live and Zoom. Everyone has been placed on listen-only mode to avoid unnecessary background noise during today's presentation. Today's accessibility features are American Sign Language and live captioning. Individuals joining today's presentation via Zoom can access their live captioning by clicking on the CC Show Captioning icon on the bottom of their screen. For Teams closed captioning, go to the More on the top right of your screen and choose Language and Speech, then turn on your closed captioning. To provide questions to your panelists today, please submit them through the Q&A feature through Zoom and the question mark through Teams. If you want to access the Stream Tech, a link is being sent through Viva Chat soon. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to share a few gentle reminders that will guide our time together today. Be present. Let's all remain engaged and focused on the discussion happening in the room. Listen to learn with a growth mindset. Approach today's event with an open mind and a willingness to learn from each other's experience. Expect and accept non-closure. Some discussions may not conclude with definitive answers, and that's okay. It's part of the ongoing journey toward progress. Realize our power and privilege and prejudice. Let's stay aware of the dynamics of power, privilege, and biases that we may bring into the space and work to challenge them. Promote institutional accountability. We all each play a role in holding our institution accountable for fostering an equitable and inclusive environment. Be respectful when submitting comments. Please be mindful and respectful of others when sharing your thoughts and feedback. And lastly, remember, nothing about us without us. This means we're committed to ensuring that those directly affected by decisions are involved in the decision-making process. Let's honor that principle throughout our event today. I would like to begin today's event by acknowledging the land and labor that have shaped the spaces we occupy. I acknowledge the traditional and ancestral and unceded territory of the Tongva people on which I'm working, residing, and presenting to you today. By acknowledging this land, I recognize the enduring presence, culture, and rights of Indigenous people and reflect on the history that continues to impact their communities. This land is a living part of their culture, and they honor their connection to the natural world here. which we must all respect. In addition, I would also like to acknowledge the century of enslaved people, primarily of African American descent, upon whose labor this country was built. This nation's economic progress and development are inseparably linked to their unpaid and forced labor. It is essential that we recognize this history as we move forward with the commitment to justice, equity, and honor came before us. Now, I'd like to pass the mic. Please welcome Brandon Marlin from the Office of Deaf Access to begin our presentation today. Brandon?
Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Brandon Marin. Use he, his pronouns. I work with the Office of Deaf Access, and I am so thrilled to welcome everyone here today to our CDSS and our Deaf Awareness event. We have some fantastic people joining us today, and I'm very much looking forward to watching their discussion on the breaking down of barriers for deaf and hard of hearing people everywhere. I'm going to start off by introducing everyone. Bill will open up for us. And as you come on, please share your name and your role. So I'm going to go ahead and start with Bill. Could you please come on camera for us?
Hello, my name is Bill Milios. I am the author of the paper I will be presenting on today, and I will be guiding the panel. It's great to be here and be involved with this event. I am so excited to share.
Thank you, Bill. Now I'm going to have Corey come on.
Hello.
Go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yes, my name is Corey Brazier. I am the Bureau Chief of Operations Bureau within the Civil Rights, Accessibility, and Resource Equity branch.
Wonderful. Thank you, Corey. Lisa, if you could join us.
Hello. I'm so happy to be here. My name is Lisa, and I work with the California Department of Developmental Services as a specialized statewide access specialist. I see a heart. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. And Nancy.
Hello, my name is Nancy Leibach Iman, and I am the Director of State Special Schools and Service Division at California Department of Education. I feel absolutely honored to be here today, and I look forward to this conversation with you this morning.
Wonderful. Thank you. All right. So, Bill, the floor is yours. I'm going to be off camera. Give me a little moment just to set up your PowerPoint.
Hello, everybody. I am so excited to be here today and go over my PowerPoint with you. So, a little bit of background. This is from a paper that was published in the JOI Journal of Interpreting under RID. And this is titled From Principles to Practice, Creating Language Equity for Deaf Professionals. So, a little bit of background on how this paper came to be. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Great. So I worked with Kelby Brick at Brick Advantage Group. We were asked to consult with the university, and the university was experiencing some struggles when it came to providing accessibility. And they had some very highly qualified deaf professionals there at the university. And these deaf professionals were moving up into places of leadership and they needed support when it came to the system of providing interpreters, captioning, cart services, all of these different access needs. As we met with this university, we realized that there needed to be a different model, a new model for providing interpreting services. The warm body interpreter approach that was in place wasn't working anymore. So how do we advance the level of services being provided there? So we took a deeper look at the practice, and what we've seen is there is an underlying principle that should be leading to practice. Because folks would ask, well, how do I do this? Or how do I do that? And I feel like the answer from us was always, well, it depends on the situation, it depends on the context. And that would cause people to struggle to create practices that work. But if people have an underlying principle and they can refer back to the underlying principles, they can create practices that fit regardless of the situation. So we had to back up and develop those underlying principles. And we had 10 plus one, but plus one is a free one. So there was three of us, along with Wyatt Hall, Dr. Wyatt Hall, from the University of Rochester. The three of us published this paper. And now today I'm going to be reviewing the principles and how these principles can apply to your situations. So these were developed in a university context, but these also can apply to corporate education, nonprofit organizations. The intention behind this was to create broad principles so that they can be applied to different scenarios and settings. If you wouldn't mind moving to the next slide. What's important is there are two words here, two vocabulary definitions that are very important. The first one is deaf-centered. All of our principle development is deaf-centered. And what that means is the first thing we have to think of is what is the most beneficial and the least harmful, that balance for deaf folks who are involved. And sometimes there are conflicts, and we have to accept and own those. And thinking about the principle 0 of RID's professional conduct, and that is do no harm. And sometimes we have a situation with two alternatives, and these both alternatives are harmful. And we have these policies to guide us. The goal is not to provide access. The goal is to provide language equity. These are two different concepts. Access is a more compliance-based term. This is forced by the law to follow, so that's more of access. Language equity is above that. Deaf folks have the right to be there, and they have the right to be equal participants. It's not a compliance issue. It's not about doing the minimum anymore. It's not about that. So these two were definitions that actually guided our development of these principles. Okay, principle 0, next slide. Autism is a permanent and pervasive. Recognize it and address it. So the word autism was created by Dr. Tom Humphreys by a paper published in 1975. What this means is individuals, as deaf people, are experiencing systematic oppression and discrimination. And these isms also apply to sexism, racism. These are experiences of discrimination from the system. So autism is on par with those other isms, and it is considered harmful. So there are systematic policies in place that cause barriers for deaf people as a whole. So it's really vital to recognize that. Some systematic autism was addressed within the Rehab Act of 1973, the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, but these are focused more on compliance and not more on a proactive removal of barriers. Next slide, please. Principle 1. Deaf people are a unique cultural and linguistic minority. Deaf people, we have our own culture, we have our own language, our own history that is passed down by generations. Impact our current state of the world and how we can succeed. We are collectivists by nature. Often you'll see deaf people as they're learning something new, and they're aside other deaf folks, they will often clarify with other deaf folks or have a discussion based on what they've just learned. A lot of side conversations happen within the deaf community, and that is a very collective behavior, and that is very normal for deaf culture. We have a very unique intersection of disability and sociolinguistics. Other groups who have disabilities don't have any language involved. We do. Interpreters alone are not addressing systematic issues of structural autism, privilege, and power that deaf people face. So it's important to recognize that. Next slide, please. Deaf people should be the primary decision makers when it comes to their access. And a synopsis of this is really, it's one word, ask. Ask the deaf person what they need and see what happens. Oftentimes, folks that are in positions of power or in positions of decision making assume deaf folks' needs and make changes and provide those changes, but they're still not working. And deaf folks will say, I don't need these specific things. And then these folks in power look at deaf people and say, oh, well, they're not thankful. Instead of doing all of that, simply ask the deaf individual what their needs are and recognize that every deaf individual's situation is unique. Maybe some of these things haven't been recognized before. Recognizing that deaf person as an individual. When deaf folks move up into positions of power and they understand the budget, it's not about things being expensive, it's about being transparent about what's involved. Next slide. Deaf people experience a quote unquote deaf tax. And basically what this is it's a minority status. This requires more energy, more stress, more labor to navigate and to become successful within the majority. When folks talk about the majority, what we're saying is folks who can hear. So increased labor, stress is real for the minority, and it requires us on a daily basis to do so to navigate the system and to navigate the world. When you go into a grocery store, you can hear announcements over the speaker. These things I miss, these little things all day I miss, and that induces increased stress. Deaf tax also includes things such as fighting for reasonable accommodations. Also, I am responsible for coordinating my access, putting that burden on me. Also, deaf mentorship. When deaf folks move up into positions of power, positions of management, who is the mentor for these folks? Nobody. Oftentimes, deaf folks moving into positions of power are the first of their time. And unfortunately, their hearing colleagues don't expect much of them. Principle 4, deaf people serve deaf people best. When you create or have positions that serve deaf people, it is really worth the little additional work to find a deaf person who is qualified to fill that position, regardless if it's accessibility services, deaf education, administrators. Putting deaf folks in these positions so that they know how to serve the population best. Deaf folks experience sabotage oftentimes within the structure of autism. When positions are created that oversee deaf people, whether they be deaf kids or deaf adults, they will usually put a hearing signer in that position that oversees deaf people so that the administrators above them can communicate well with that person. This person may be able to sign, maybe there is language access there, but they don't have the lived experience that deaf people have. They simply don't have those underlying things that we experience on a daily basis. These things are part of our psyche. These things are just a part of us. They're ingrained. So when people like this, hearing folks who can just sign, are hired, it's not a deaf-centric approach. It's really important to hire deaf folks into these positions. Next slide, please.
The success of marginalized communities is worthy of recognition. So as deaf people move up, we need to celebrate the achievements that they've accomplished. That's critical. Other people are able to look at them and realize they can achieve the same things as well. And that will create a ripple effect. Go ahead to the next slide. Interpreters are guests in the interpreting relationship. So do deaf people really want interpreters? Honestly, we'd rather do without. But reality is we are stuck from cradle to grave with the experience of having an interpreter come in and participate unwanted necessarily. Next slide. Assigning appropriately qualified interpreters is critical. And these are things that can impact what means qualified. Who are the deaf and hearing participants? What is the context and content? What are the communication goals? And what is the setting? Any one of those that change may require an interpreter to be replaced with another one. Again, ask a deaf person, is this interpreter qualified for this event, this assignment? And they can assess whether or not the interpreter is. Go ahead and go to the next slide. Certification is a minimum standard. Many people believe that certification is basically the gold medal of interpreting. That is not the case. It is a minimum standard. Go ahead and go to the next slide. The interpreter is there for all parties. When deaf people are talking to each other, we don't need interpreters. Interpreters become necessary when there's a hearing person that joins in. They are creating the need, not us. I mean, it's a little ironic, but it is important to remember the interpreters are there for everyone. They're not there for the deaf person only. And slide 10. The profession of interpreting is always evolving. People who've interpreters used to be community-based, family-based, church-based. Now they're with the Americans with Disability Act, the provision of interpreters has had a huge increase in demand. More and more interpreters who become interpreters are assigned to jobs sometimes they're even social navigators in a way. So as deaf people move to these higher levels, they're relying on that relationship between the deaf person, the deaf professional, and the interpreter, which then starts evolving. So in summary, my principles are there. So I'm going to hand it back over to Brandon.
Wow, thank you, Bill. Okay, all of the panelists can come on screen and we will start the discussion. Okay, we'll turn off my camera and onto you, Bill.
Wow, that was really fast going through those, but you got an overall idea. So let's go ahead and start with the discussion. I do have a few questions from other individuals. So Brandon, I don't know if you want to introduce those.
Yes, so those questions were actually in the document, so you can follow those as you please.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you, Brandon. Give me a moment to open the document.
This
This
is
is Nancy. Go ahead.
I have a comment. I am relieved to see these topics being brought up this morning with you because it's giving the power back to us as we try to navigate our way through the system within the state of California. These things are not easy. There's a lot of pushback, there's a lot of assumptions, and it becomes dangerous. And it actually instills a lot of fear within us in our roles. We want to do our best, but we're still dealing with accessibility issues at the same time.
Like the death tax.
Exactly. The deaf tax, you said it perfectly.
You wanted to add something, Lisa?
Yes, I want to say that this time is perfect. And thank you so much, Bill, for joining us here in California from the East Coast. September 13th and 14th, we had a first ever weekend event. It was actually a Interpreters for Deaf Professionals Summit. I felt seen and heard there during that weekend. There was about 250 participants and so many deaf professionals, about 75 of them showed up. And we had such intense discussions and wonderful presenters, and it felt such like a collaboration and to ensure that we're utilizing interpreters to maximize as much as we can. So, and oftentimes, big cities have a lot of interpreters, but there is a huge interpreter shortage. I know, Bill, you have a research study about that. I would love if you shared. But, how can I better prepare myself? Sometimes it takes time for deaf professionals, that deaf tax. We have to do a lot of behind the scenes work and really set up a repository of information, of vocabulary, terms, how to voice specific signs, how to sign different acronyms, and save all of that on OneDrive. So when I meet a new interpreter, they would need to access that repository and represent us better. Bill?
Yes. Um, Looking into the numbers of interpreters out there has definitely confirmed there's a shortage. This is a nationwide problem. And it's interesting because I've noticed that there are pockets of privilege. There are certain specific areas where they have enough interpreters to cover their needs. University environments, more wealthy corporations who have the money, they can recruit and hire the best. And they can bring in those deaf people who then are able to get a relationship with those interpreters. And those interpreters end up becoming better at interpreting for those specific deaf individuals because of that ongoing relationship, because the designated interpreter concept. And you're starting to see smaller and smaller pools of interpreters that work in specific environments. With these small group of deaf people, you have a small group of interpreters. And those pockets of privilege are very fortunate. But then we have the people who are at the middle, so to speak, who call interpreters on an as needed basis, and they're doing all right. But we still have those people who never get access or who are denied access on a daily basis. Every single day, they are struggling. And interpreters in the school systems are a perfect example. Oftentimes, newer interpreters are sent to interpret at elementary schools, middle schools to interpret. These are individuals that are not ready. We should be sending the best of our best to the schools. Instead, they're getting those who are less qualified. So it is a struggle between who has the privilege of access and who is still not getting that.
This is Nancy. Not only that, but I'd like to add is the system sets it up this way. So many programs within California, they set them up to fail. And to give you an example of this is if I need an interpreter, I'm not using my staff interpreter, to get an interpreter for any type of meeting, I need to go through the contract process within DGS, Department of General Services. And DGS requires us to follow a contractual manual, and it's the standard for the state of California. And a lot of interpreter agencies bid for these contracts, and DGS sets up criteria for IFBs, and they always go for the lowest bidder. That is their standard they've set up. So when I am connected with an agency that doesn't know me as a consumer and doesn't understand the community need at large, and finally we would find one agency out of, or maybe one interpreter out of 50 interpreters that actually can accommodate my needs. And they have that perspective of, well, as long as we filled the request. But where is my right? ADA should be looking at what my rights are and what I need.
Yes, equity instead of following along with what needs to be. So there are situations where there's a boomerang effect. So we bring in a contract of whoever's the cheapest, and then we're stuck with that for 2 to 3 years of subpar service. People complain until finally that can change with well-qualified groups of interpreters. And then for 2 to 3 years, life is golden. And then the HR person that ran the contract that originally made that change after the next cycle will go back to the lowest bid again. So we're going back to square one with those bad situations we had before. People have to put up with it 2 to 3 years, and it becomes that boomerang of having to go through that cycle over and over again. So once you develop a criteria, you have to make sure you're including deaf people in that. That is your road to success and how you can develop the rubric. So it's not just based on the cons, but it's also based on the qualities we want to encourage and make sure that deaf people are including what needs to be in there to have the better quality group. And that will lead to success with including the evaluation of costs. You need to think about it, but you also have the criteria. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Lisa.
I would also like to add two things. I would like to add some hope as well. I feel like we have become experts in navigating these challenges. Within Department of Developmental Services, DDS, I've really appreciated my team. We have faced things like you have mentioned, but we've also found solutions to navigate the system. Again, it is more of a burden on us that deaf tax is happening. Reaching out to interpreters who are experts within interpreting for presentations and also legal meetings. And these interpreters are willing to sign up with these agency contracts. So now I have different pools of interpreters. If it's this type of meeting, then I reach out to this pool. And I think this is the best way, a best approach until we fix it, because our accessibility should not fall under DGS's criterion. And accessibility is a law, and it should not be a bidding process. So I look forward to one day removing, interpreters, accessibility, removing that out of DGS and also the IFB process as well.
And this is Corey. I'd like to go back to Bill's comment about the boomerang effect. He's absolutely right. Every few years, it goes over and over again where there's this big change. And sometimes there are specific issues that come up, like a multilingual agency, for example. These are people who are not specializing in providing services for deaf consumers and deaf people. So oftentimes it's a struggle to meet our needs for them. And so that's where our frustrations come in. And we try to let people know these are the specific needs we have. These are the minimum qualifications we need, but that's not always applied to what's required by DGS. So we want to maybe even consider a way to remove that from the platform.
This is Bill. I have a question for you. Can you explain an experience where you were sidelined as a primary decision maker about your own access? Or when somebody increased an effort to include you as a primary decision maker? Can you talk about either or both of those experiences?
I'll go ahead and kick us off. So absolutely. It's happened in various ways. Oftentimes it comes down to communication barriers or unconscious biases from people. One example is there was a particular meeting where there was an important decision that had to be made during this meeting. So as we were going along, there were a lot of people who were talking over each other. So, and there's also a delay in my receiving the information because interpreting requires time to translate. So it ends up putting me in a disadvantageous position. So by the time I actually receive that information, that discussion has moved on to the next topic. So to try and bring it back to what I wanted to say kind of derails the whole meeting. And of course, my input or my comment can be overlooked. It can be dismissed. And so that is an unintentional dismissal that happens because of the decision-making process.
Thank you. Nancy?
Yes, for me, I used to work in the private sector in a primarily hearing environment. And when I started off in that role, at that time, I was very passive and meek. You know, that's the way it is. You make the decision, and then maybe you could ask me some question, but I had to fight with respect and go through the whole process. Then I started working at a school specifically for deaf students, and it changed. It became a deaf space. So I was in full control of what was going on. Then I moved on to where, and it's different now, it's at the state level where there's a very large percentage of hearing individuals. And it went back to that more formal process. And I said, no, I choose not to do this anymore. So I ended up becoming more of, I have needs that you need to meet. I am not going to walk on eggshells. You have to meet me. We have to come to an agreement together. And I'll make my statement and then I just let it go. And then I wait until the right time when the two of us are ready to meet with the right people involved, then that can happen. But it is very time consuming and exhausting. Why am I doing this when that's impacting the deaf community? You have to go further, not me. It's not about me. It was never about me. It was about the content. It was about the topics. So to bring that new awareness was huge. So I really noticed an attitude shift in myself.
This is Lisa. I have a few examples, but each example was actually a lesson for me. And after that happened, I said I would never put myself in that situation again. One example is I worked with my chief deputy director on a weekly basis. We had a one-on-one meeting, and there was a interpreter change, and it was changed over to a non-preferred interpreter. And my chief recognized that there was issues with the communication and would check in with me. And, that accessibility doesn't only fall on me, but also falls on the hearing person too. Sometimes it would be so bad to where he would actually give me a signal and he would wiggle his ear, which meant, let's wrap up the meeting, the interpreter's not doing well, and would email me afterwards. And there are some interpreters that have absolutely no business working within the state level. We have specialists. We have specialists within legal interpreters, specialists within theater. But I've had interpreters that I've had wonderful relationships built with, which have been great. The second example is we actually had, oh, did I freeze?
You
Sorry.
did, but you're back now.
Okay. I was actually presenting somewhere. And I absolutely trusted for the interpreters to arrive and schedule to be there. And sometimes I arrive early and I like to mingle beforehand. And the interpreters who were there that day, especially if it's not from somewhere local. These are folks who are out of town, and I'm not familiar with the interpreters in that area. I'm at a disadvantage. Will they actually voice properly for me? Um, that's at Deaf Tax. So what I do is I have to write my speech beforehand, specific word choices that I want them to utilize. ASL, we have about 8 to 10,000 signs, whilst English, there are 200,000 words. And I'm picky. I like certain terms to be utilized. I don't want the interpreter to choose these words for me. I want to emphasize some of these terms, and I like to utilize this vernacular. And a lot of interpreters don't have that experience to do so. So I'm typing my speech or what I have to say beforehand the night before, and that is that deaf tax. And my team now is saying, no, Lisa, just bring a designated interpreter, someone that you prefer with you. And I'm like, oh my gosh, what a game changer. Having a designated interpreter with me at all times. Yes, there may be interpreters for the conference, but when I interact with my team, when I meet other executives from other agencies, businesses, corporations, I have equal access. And, there are solutions, but there are workarounds. Like, for example, I was just watching the captions, and Bill, you were talking about deaf-centered. I always have the captions on to ensure that my point is getting across. Bill was talking about the deaf-centered approach, and the captioner typed death-centered. So, that we always have to monitor and we always have to be on.
Yeah, it's definitely not that. And not for this webinar. But I think many people oftentimes forget that both deaf and hearing people have the burden of harm. And almost 100% of the time, it falls on the deaf person. When interpreters sound less than professional, when interpreters choose the wrong words, when interpreters miss things, whatever it is that's going on, from whichever direction, whether they're working into English or into ASL, hearing people as a whole, the majority population, can go, sounds a little bit like this person doesn't know what they're doing. So that's an ongoing burden and it's persistent. This is someone who has an advanced degree and a doctorate, but gosh, they sound more like a high school student. They're not really hitting that level that I would expect in vocabulary. And so that thought for that hearing person sticks. So the next time there's a meeting, they'll remember this person and go, oh, yeah, I remember them. That ends up having a carryover effect that builds over time. So will hearing people want to work with these deaf individuals? If they ask their peers, they may say, well, yeah, this is an interesting person, and they won't really go into more depth because that has already taken root, that idea of them not being sufficient. And so that causes lasting harm in that deaf person's relationships with their colleagues, with their peers, the whole gamut. I'd also like to ask what appropriately qualified interpreting means to you. That's a fun question. Is a certification for an interpreter sufficient? Haha.
This is Lisa. I feel when it comes to interpreters for me, they need to be able to power up. I am not somebody who is meek and quiet within meetings. My desires to express myself and my dialect typically changes. So when somebody is interpreting for me, their tone is essential. And for them to power up within dynamic discussions, I don't appreciate interpreters who are telling me to hold on, don't tell me to wait for me to say something. And also people skills, and please dress appropriately. We have some phenomenal interpreters. I don't want to say that we don't, but I would like to be represented well. And the use of terminology as well. Again, strong emphasis on terminology, not just the minimum. I'm not an elementary school teacher. I'm sorry. I'm in a position where I influence policy. I have a very strong legal background as well, and I would like to represent myself well. And I appreciate when interpreters own up properly. I find often before starting something, starting a presentation or a meeting, we set up agreements. And during the time, we will set up specific things and we will change. I don't appreciate when interpreters are saying or when they're trying to voice for me. I would appreciate for the interpreter to raise their hand and say, the interpreter's trying to catch up. I need some time and own up to that. These types of skills are so essential to me.
Nancy's saying, yeah, for me as well, it's important to know how the interpreter makes me look. So when I go into a room and I start the meeting and the interpreter is going, okay, well, hold on, I need to set things up. I do not like that. Do not be too helpful.
Yeah, that increases your footprint.
Yeah, no, thank you. Just come in, look professional, go with the flow. Trust me as a peer at any event. If there's like a deaf person, and don't sit there and go, okay, this is where you're going to be in this particular room. Because I don't want to be sitting where I'm alone and no one else is near me. I do not need that. A lot of times assumptions happen again, and it depends a lot on how the organizer of the event made these plans in advance. And if I communicate, I just need to make sure that I can see the interpreter. That's all. You don't have to do more than that. I do not need all this fluff and business. As long as the interpreter can see me sign, that's great. I can watch and be aware that there is a lag time as well. And so I'll oftentimes tell people you need to speak with me a few minutes before, to ask for clarification before you move on to the next topic. Because it's about me, it's not about you. So I've had to draw that line with a lot of my hearing peers, especially when it comes to the interpreter. I tell them this person is a voice box. That's all. Everything is owned by me. Everything that's being said is by me. And when an interpreter is not able to keep up with my tone and the intent of my message itself, I have a very firm message. I expect there to be a firm tone that goes along with that. I don't want the interpreter to soften up my language, but to follow the emotions and the reactions I am expressing in that moment. They should be aligned.
This is Corey. For me, it always goes back to the interpreter's ability to match the deaf person. They may be qualified, yes, but can they also match our communication style or preference? If there is a lack of repertoire or the lack of understanding between the interpreter and myself, that can lead to errors within communication or misinterpretations, and it causes just more frustration. Also, some interpreters have a lack of industry-specific knowledge that is critical for communication within specialized settings. For example, vocabulary, acronyms, jargon, especially within government settings. Misinterpretations can lead to confusion, errors within the message, and that pushes us away from being involved in areas we should be.
Let me ask, in the paper that we wrote, we emphasized the idea of spotlighting on how interpreters for deaf professionals are becoming more and more relied on social, cultural navigators. They are kind of becoming that for deaf professionals. So, for example, Nancy earlier talked about walking into a room and you know the culture of the people who are in that room. And it may be different from an interpreter who has experience at some other event. So sometimes when the deaf people come in, we can be unsure who is in charge here. When there's like the talking going on around the room, those little coffee chats, the water cooler conversations. So, do you have any experience where you've used interpreter specifically as navigators for a new or unique space?
This is Nancy. You know, many times actually, when I attend conferences, this is a good example. When I attend conferences and everybody is hearing except myself, and I'm the only deaf individual, I make sure that myself and the interpreter have a conversation beforehand. Or I will show up and find a team of interpreters, and there may be interpreters there for other deaf consumers. A lot of times they assume that they're there for other deaf folks, but it's actually just for me because I'm the only deaf person. And I want the interpreter to tag along with me throughout the conference because I like to join different spaces of conversation and I can jump in. And I tell my interpreter, anytime I want to make a comment, interrupt them. I know I'm interrupting. Don't wait until the conversation's finished for me to interrupt, because when I do interrupt, we reset the communication dynamic, and then we're able to proceed. I can always tell when maybe somebody is not in the right mood to have that type of discussion with me. So I'll ask the interpreter, you don't have to tell me everything of what's going on in the environment. Sometimes I need a mental break, right? But sometimes meetings are important and I need to know. But it is my responsibility to tell the interpreter of what I'm looking for so that they're prepared for all of the topics that I may bring up. And that's what I typically do.
Lisa, I think different settings, exactly as Nancy mentioned, it's critical to be able to adjust in the moment. So, for example, a working lunch in person. Sometimes you're in all-day meetings. When lunchtime comes, the staff are very sweet. They feed the interpreter, come on, eat with us. But then that means that I've lost access to information during the lunch. And that's honestly the funnest part of the day is to really just talk with people on a human level as part of the team. And I enjoy that. And they want to take care of the interpreter, which is great, but please ask me first. Or maybe feed just, if there's a team of interpreters, feed one at a time so they can switch off. So again, as you mentioned, ask the deaf person. They know the culture. And also interpreter training programs should be teaching people how to work with individuals. I don't like it when people, have their lunch and they provide that to the interpreters, or sometimes at dinner time, people will sit far away, even though, you don't always know who's talking. So it really depends on who it is you want to interact with. And it's great if you can even split the roles where one interpreter only does the signing, one person only does the voicing. And instead of having the bimodal where one interpreter is doing everything, that can make it more difficult. I like it best when they're able to split the roles. But again, ask the deaf person what works for them in that culture, in that environment. And the skills the interpreters develop should be able to make use of all that information.
This is Bill. I used to work within a private corporation and I would attend meetings and often wouldn't know folks there, their positions and their roles and where they stand with the company. And this corporation was very sensitive on who would move up and the levels within the company. So when the vice president was speaking, you didn't interrupt. And then when another individual was speaking, yes, it was more interactive. And you could interrupt folks who were maybe on the lower level of the corporation. And some interpreters were very helpful with listening to not just the tone of the individual speaking, but also the tone of people who were listening, their level of respect when it came to uh, having dialogue with the individual. They may say things such as, yes, sir, or yes, ma'am, and having that respect within their language. I was able to recognize, oh, I should also approach them with the same tone. These are social navigation cues that are so critical for the success of an employee. And I was always very thankful for these interpreters because they get it. And I never really knew how to ask for that, but they really helped me navigating strange situations when it came to meeting new people.
Yeah, I was going to add in too, that applies to me as a deaf person when I'm, you know, switching, right? The way I communicate with people. Sometimes it's sometimes intentional, it's sometimes not. So to be at the point where you can kind of switch with the way you're interacting people without thinking, even, interpreters can control that for me. And that's something that I want to mention. I'm not sure I'm really a fan of that because it means I can't really trust that interpreter. So I need to make that change in how I sign to make sure they're getting exactly what it is I am trying to convey in my message. So when I have to make that change later on, people will perhaps ask me, was there anything wrong? How can I fix? And it's hard for me to do the feedback. It's hard to find the right time. Sometimes interpreters are not able to take feedback. Some interpreters can't handle it. Honestly, then maybe they shouldn't be interpreters because there's always room for improvement. I believe everyone has to understand their roles and responsibilities as an interpreter can continue to improve. If you don't want that, this is not the right field for you. You have to value and respect the person who's relaying that message with how you relay it.
Yes, and that ties to power and privilege. Interpreters have a lot of power. And we, as deaf people, when we try to give them feedback and support, they often take it as, well, I don't need that. But you control my worlds. If you're upset, then my access goes away or it's minimized. So it's that constant dance of, hey, would you mind? It shouldn't be, hey, would you mind? It should be, this is my feedback, follow it. But these interpreters, they don't realize they hold power, and there is that intersection of power from them. But you will be here if it wasn't for me in this space. So that's a challenge sometimes. And new interpreters, novice interpreters, don't have a lot of experience when it comes to conversation management. In interpreter training programs, they teach how to voice for a deaf individual and sign for a hearing individual. But they don't teach those critical soft skills when it's a right to interrupt, and then also interrupting with lag time, because by the time like Corey mentioned earlier, there's a lot of lag time involved. And sometimes the deaf person will interrupt, but it may be the wrong time. you, as the interpreter, need to deal with it. You need to learn how to interrupt and not interrupt in a way of where hearing folks think, well, that person's rude and they interrupted at the wrong time. So having to manage that and navigating that, that's a process for everyone involved. So I'm really curious, how does this impact you as hearing people when they perceive interpreters for you?
Yeah, the interpreter's for them. The interpreter's not for me.
Could
I mean,
you
we're for everyone.
could you expand on that?
It's so funny in Zoom sometimes. Think there's this issue of raising awareness more and more. Sometimes on Zoom, people will jump in, and there might be technical difficulties. And I always love saying, if everyone here knew sign language, it would make the world a better place.
Yes.
So I see that happening frequently. I think again and again, if we constantly emphasize the interpreters are here for you. Sometimes the team will ask me, oh, do you have an interpreter there? And I say, no, I don't need the interpreter over there. I will need the interpreter to be near you because I need the interpreter to tell me something. And those people will be like, oh, okay. So sometimes how we approach it is key. And again, there's that deaf tax where we as deaf professionals have to think how delivery is done. And often you have to think of things such as metaphors so that hearing people go, oh, now I can understand it. So we can readjust the Zoom so that a lot of people are able to see what's going on. I mean, I make a joke. I always like to add humor, but I'm wondering, if deaf people only had, bigger eyes than hearing people, right?
Don't tell people that. Don't spread that news.
But it helps people to go, oh, okay, so you need to watch the screen and not just the audio. Okay, so then let's take care of this. Let's readjust the screen. Let's make things look different. So it's all in how we present ourselves. A lot of times I add humor, but hopefully people will remember it for the future then.
This is Corey, going back to what Nancy was talking about earlier. When you go into a room and the interpreters have already taken their space and set up the environment for you, what that looks like for me is I have been kind of signaled out. And people view the interpreter as a necessity, and that creates more barriers to include me in discussions. And it causes issues within equity and also communication. And that's where I would prefer the interpreter is there for everybody, not just me. It would be nice to see folks say, how can we look at it in that way? We all need the interpreter. As Lisa just mentioned, especially on Zoom, if folks are struggling with audio, fine, let's just sign. If everybody signed, we wouldn't have that issue.
Yeah, I've had an experience where I've gone to a presentation with a hearing speaker. The interpreter comes along and people kind of look at me and I say, this is your interpreter for today. Their name is such and such. And the hearing person will be taken aback. You'll actually literally see that head of theirs go back as they're processing what I say. I'm like, all right, because I like to emphasize this idea. This interpreter's here for you. This interpreter is not here for me. I mean, again, there's the humor, make it a little light. We don't want to hit anybody with a hammer, but sometimes we do those little things that will stick in their mind. Or you can even say, this is our interpreter today, so and so. This is not my interpreter. This is our interpreter or your interpreter. It depends on the context for me. But I like that idea of helpful language to set this framework. Just these little ways to fight back.
This is Nancy. I work with young children, pre-K all the way up till 12th grade, and I work with different types of adults. There is quite the variety of adults I work with. And I often tell the interpreter I'm working with, hey, we don't live together, right? You don't have, you don't own my car. I have my own perspective. Remember, I'm my own person and you are your own person. You have your opinions, I have mine. It's not that we're becoming one person. You speak for yourself, I speak for myself, right? It's not two have become one.
Yeah, people think we keep interpreters in the closet when we don't need them.
Yes,
And then at 9 a.m., we pull the interpreter out and use them again.
exactly, exactly. And another thing that I've noticed quite frequently, something that I wanted to throw out here in this space, is there sometimes interpreters don't show up, especially like on Zoom meetings, and folks say, oh, well, it's fine, just utilize the captions. Okay, if we want to just rely on the captions, let's turn off the volume for everybody else. That's equal access. Let's turn off the volume for you and now rely on the captions. And that puts a strain on that process. It's the same. They, I want them to understand that's a strain on us to watch captions. Captions do not replace interpreters. I want to emphasize that point.
One other thing I'd like to add too is I found it a privilege sometimes to have captions on during Zoom meetings while the interpreter's working, because then we have specifically intellectual disabilities that happen for individuals sometimes. So for those who are maybe watching today, there's one sign that may have 8 to 12 different meanings in it. So the sign for intellectual development disabilities can be interpreted as smart. So I was at a meeting and I signed that, the intellectual developmental disability, and the interpreter used the word smart development disability. And that was ongoing until finally someone else at the agency was asking, oh, do you mean smart as in like the Smarties candies? And that threw off everything. I was sitting there going, what are you talking about? So, and then immediately everything I realized was lost in translation. And so, yeah, Smarties, helped me become smarter, which made everyone laugh. But I do wish that the interpreter could have owned it a little bit better and come forward and said, oh, excuse me. I interpreted in a court system for 14 years, and that requires that you have a oath of equitable interpretations. So I think that that would be something where you would come forward and say, like, Your Honor, I used this particular word. I should have used this other word instead. That's how the court system handles it. So it's not on the defendant, it's not on the witness. And then it's something that's corrected in the record. But we don't always have that training for anybody who's out in the community, outside in the state level. And I see interpreters who do their best and they'll say, oh, excuse me, instead of Smarties, I should have said intellectual. Both of those look a very similar sign, but to put that out in the communication, but obviously it got lost in translation. That one is a humorous story for me to remember.
All right. Hello, everybody. So sorry to interrupt this just wonderful discussion. I wish we could continue, but we need some time for the QA session from the audience. I will post these questions into the chat, and then you guys can answer them as you please. Before we start this, the audience can ask questions as long as you post those questions within the QA. Please don't send a direct message. First question is, hello, my name is Paige Johnson, DSS Small Business Advocate. How can I outreach to more small businesses and disabled veterans business enterprise vendors so we can provide information on DSS ASL contracts? Since they are limited DVBE ASL vendors and more importantly, vendors preferred by the deaf community.
So my understanding is that historically, some agencies have run deaf-centered interpreting and have actually signed up. So your license would expire after X number of years, you would have to renew it. So perhaps you could offer some kind of training or presentation in ASL for that type of vendor training, and then figure out the best way to support them so that they would be able to renew. So maybe they did it in 2002, but then they haven't won any contracts since then. They wouldn't bother renewing. So they would know they would need to do a better job maybe with outreach just to keep them informed and ongoing.
This is Corey here. Many small businesses, well, let me back up here. A lot of deaf-centered agencies that provide ASL interpreting services only, not multilingual services. They are contracted as small businesses, as Lisa mentioned, but often within the contractual process, DVBE needs to be embedded in there as an incentive. Many agencies who are owned by deaf individuals and also are owned by women, and a lot of them have never been in a military setting and never served in the military. So oftentimes companies who have disabled veterans, small business, they win these contracts. And but the issue is these deaf-centered agencies will provide the better service, but these DVBE vendors are winning the contracts.
All right, let me move on to the next question. It says, what are your recommendations to greet a deaf person at an event or conference if there's no interpreter available?
This is Nancy. The best solution is learn sign language. Say hello. Be polite. Just say hi. And learn to fingerspell. Fingerspelling makes a huge difference. To me, everybody should learn how to fingerspell. All of us, so that everything is accessible for everybody.
And you can use gestures as well. Don't be afraid. Don't just stand there like a stick. You'd be amazed how much you can communicate through gesturing. There are also apps as well. There are some people that are really great at pulling out their phone and they can speak to Siri, and then I could perhaps text back.
This is Corey. I wanted to add here, just because there's no interpreter present, you can still approach us, as Lisa said, use gestures, use your phone. We can text on the phone. We can write on a document together. There's so many different ways you can communicate with us.
All right, I'll go on to the next question. It's really more of a comment, but I still wanted to make sure it went out there. The comment is, thank you so much for this education and awareness. As an organization, we must do better. It's events like these that show us what needs to change, and I hope that there are allies and decision makers who will make the changes necessary for our deaf and hard of hearing colleagues to have more than the minimum, but quality, equitable access to communication, which is a basic necessity to our work. So I wanted to call out that comment.
Thank you.
All right, on to the fourth question. This may be a hard question, but how would DGS be approached to address how their contracting process might impact interpreting services? So, because not all necessarily have the skills ready and abilities to do meetings, to do interpretation into English. So how can we do that equity?
SSAI staff interpreters don't have the voicing ability to voice for deaf professionals. This is Nancy. First, California needs to change the regulations. There are no regulations currently in place. How do you determine these regulations? There are no foundations established. We need to focus on that initially within the state level. Secondly, SSAIs is not appropriate classification. It needs to be revisited. So your question is quite a loaded question there. We need to look at how we can change the classification itself, because interpreters, if you want the best of the best and you want high quality interpreters, they need to have a better pay grade.
Yeah, and let me also add on as well. SSAI was designed back in the 80s. And at that time, interpreters were viewed as helpers as opposed to professionals. So that classification is still being reflected from that time period. We need to change that classification. Right now, those minimum requirements that are in there are absolutely nothing compared to the industry standards that exist today that have left those in the dust. So for that reason, I feel that it needs to be fully abolished and created anew because I'm just not sure how we can improve that classification from where it exists.
This is Bill. In California, do you require licensure for interpreters?
No, we do not.
This is Nancy. There is no licensure.
Yeah, I encourage you to do that. We have deaf people who serve deaf people best, right?
This is
So there will be a domino effect.
This is Corey. There's a lot of deaf folks here in California that wants to set up a statewide certification and licensure requirement because California only has two requirements: educational interpreter performance assessment, EIPA, to work within K-12 settings, and also legal certification. That's it. There is no other requirement to work as an interpreter here. So if we establish a certification requirement in statute, and also set up licensure, we can better control the quality of interpreters at large. At the moment, there are a lot of interpreters who are not certified and unqualified that are still taking jobs because it's cheaper for the agency to pay out those interpreters. We need to have a system in place to bar interpreter agencies to utilize these interpreters. However, it's a need. It's a big need right now.
And people oftentimes are afraid of regulations. So if there are regulations, those actually end up reducing harm. It's as simple as that. So the question is harm occurring? If so, then there needs to be discussion. There needs to be regulation to control that, to plan for that. So I would very much encourage California to consider setting up a statewide licensure.
This is Lisa.
It's been effective in other states. It is a process. Keep that in mind. It is a challenge. It is difficult. It's controversial. All of this is true, but ultimately it reduces harm for deaf people.
I'd like to add, as a current solution, we're stuck with what we have here at my agency. They actually allow me to use a contract for external interpreting services, so I'm not just stuck with a full-time staff interpreter for multiple needs. You know, all deaf individuals in upper level management should have options to be able to contract for external interpreting services for specialized meetings, specialized presentations, because we work really hard to get where we're at and we should be represented appropriately. So agencies should have multiple contracts in place for these different environments and settings.
Thank you so much. We have about minutes remaining and another 2 to 3 questions. So now that we've had this and we've recognized the importance of Deaf History Month, do we maybe look for other possibilities to add more trainings in the future for the departments that specifically work for their position levels?
This is Lisa. I think a training on the statewide level, but we also need to start stepping into interpreting training programs and support them. To give you an example, Interpreting for Deaf Professionals Summit last week, there were a lot of points made. There are a lot of deaf folks who are attaining doctorate degrees. Interpreting training programs are very minimum qualifications. So, is there an actual desire for interpreters to attain these degrees within architecture, engineering? The short answer is we don't have that luxury at the moment. But providing that training on the statewide level, but also stepping into interpreting programs is absolutely needed.
And you really need to make sure that the deaf people are involved in and people from the community in those interpreter training programs. When the ADA was passed, it became a moneymaker, and deaf people were shunted off to the side and were not really given control over that gatekeeping of who could and couldn't become interpreters. So we need to incorporate more deaf people into those programs from the get-go. And sometimes students go all the way through a program and graduate without ever seeing deaf people. All the way. Or maybe they've seen one or two after all of those years. And now all of a sudden they're out there meeting deaf people when they're working. That's not cool. That is not the way it should be done.
This is Corey. I'd also like to add to the training portion that we've been discussing. I don't know about other departments, but in my department, I'm noticing that we have training focused on for supervisors, such as FMLA, reasonable accommodations, but there is no other information attaining to working with deaf people, how to be inclusive of deaf people, and all of that. There's no trainings out there for that.
Yeah, and I was looking into the next question that we're talking about training, but there's one a comment I wanted to make. Putting up certification required, the certification requirements because of the interpreter shortage. That is a fear that we have to get rid of. We have to get rid of that. We cannot let that control us. We have to open up our thinking to a more psychological view. Now there are a lot of deaf children coming into this world who have cochlear implants, some who have been given oral training where they only use spoken language. That means that deaf signers are slowly dwindling in numbers. That myth is not true. It's exactly the opposite. Numbers are growing. So spoken language will always be here. Signed language will always be here. Both will always exist. People have more options and more motivation to learn multiple languages. And we need to recognize that. And that's where we really need to push. And we need to check, all of these
Yeah,
put
checking
these
balances.
balances about having, colleges who are offering more programs, deaf education programs are shrinking. They should be growing. In California, there's a huge need, and that includes interpreting programs. So everything is growing, and we always see the need, but the problem is we're not talking about the workforce down the line. Is the demand there? I don't know. But if we have this exposure early on, then people will want to become interpreters as careers, as professionals. We need to look that way, and we need to be willing to take the risk to make it happen.
This is Corey. As you mentioned, the number of people that do sign are increasing. Plus, in more areas, they're becoming aware of the need of making sure their information is accessible. And that ends up to where we are now, where there is just a shortage of interpreters. And it's not only because of certification, it's actually the awareness. The awareness of the need for interpreters is expanding. And I feel like it's a double-edged sword kind of question.
And I would also like to add another really important thing, specifically when it comes to California. Corey's already familiar with this about accessibility.
The language
So
access policy.
yes, so that we would be able to give deaf interpreters websites that require accessibilities in American Sign Language or documents that are actually given in ASL. I would love to see hearing interpreters take the time to say, yes, this can be done by a deaf interpreter. So refer deaf interpreters to these opportunities because there is plenty of work out there for hearing interpreters. So as a community, I think we could all do better.
This is Brandon. Thank you. Oh, it seems like we are at time. Hi, Anne.
I have a couple more minutes if you want to finish answering a couple questions.
Yeah, I think we have one more question and then we'll wrap it up. Thank you, Anne. Okay, last question. It's a comment, but question is in regards to the Accessibility Bill 3193 Assembly Bill that was actually allowing Department of Rehab to purchase up to $25,000 worth of assistive technology without a competitive RFP process. Will this panel be in support of a similar initiative for interpreting contracts and hiring the best vendors and paying them appropriately for interpreting services? We know the process now is being awarded to the lowest bidder. Do you want to add to
Nancy says definitely.
this? Is Lisa. If that change happens, these single language and sign language agencies need to hire better interpreters instead of looking at hiring low qualified interpreters and paying out low qualified interpreters. We need to look at the skill sets involved and maybe steal some legal interpreters out of the courts, but we need access. It should not be only by the bidding process. This is a legal obligation to ensure we have qualified interpreters, and the definition of qualified has been ever changing.
Corey says, I'm still kind of torn with that one because, there's so much money, but to do it
25,000.
all in less than 2 months, how is that helping us? Yeah.
Yeah. This is Lisa. We need to raise it up to $200,000 to $300,000.
Run it. All right. That ends our Q&A. So there's some closing comments that I thought would be a perfect fit. And it says here, it's not so much a question, but I want to say that this has been one of the best panels I have ever seen and witnessed. So many thanks to our presenters and for really showing the impact and how autism works. This presentation will be staying with me for a long time.
Wow, thank you.
So I'm going to say thank you to Bill, Lisa, Nancy, and Corey.
Thank you.
All right, let's go ahead and turn our cameras off and then we can have our host close us out.
Thank you. Thank you to our guests, our panelists, our interpreters, and thank you all so much for participating and the engagement today. We hope this event sparks meaningful conversation and actions as we continue to advance language equity for deaf state employees. We will be sending out a follow-up email with resources and an event survey. Your feedback is greatly appreciated. Before we close, I'd like to remind you of some of the important upcoming events. Hispanic Heritage Month, taking place from September 15th to October 15th, where we celebrate the rich history, culture, and contribution of Hispanic and Latino communities. National Disability Employment Awareness Month in October, where we highlight the importance of inclusive hiring practices and the valuable contributions of employees with disabilities. Native American and American Indian and Alaskan Native Heritage Month in November, where we will honor the history, culture, and contribution of Native and Indigenous people with 2 trainings. Look forward to that email. We look forward to seeing you in these future events, and we will continue to learn and grow together. Thank you again, and have a wonderful rest of the day.